Welcome to Australian Survivor Archives, the only podcast going over the complete history of Australian Survivor from Whalers Way right through to the present day. We have a very exciting episode for you today, another interview, but just like we did during the first season of Australian Survivor, we thought we would track down the person behind the music of the season that we are covering. Of course, we had a great chat last season to Jack Robin, the composer behind the first season's theme, and we have managed to now track down the composer of the second season's theme, a theme that Matt and I have constantly talked up a lot throughout this season, and are very, very excited to hear just how it came about and all the ins and outs that this theme had when it was produced. My name is Ben Waterworth, and I'm going to hand it over to my esteemed colleague to introduce our esteemed guest on the show today.
Hi, Ben. Hi, listeners. It's Matt Dyson here, as always. And you're right, Ben. Last season, of course, we did interview Jack Robin, and it was such a fascinating interview because we love the theme music from these early Survivor seasons. It's just something special about them. And today is no different because we're going to learn all about the season 2 theme song and all the other music in the season. Of course, today we're here with the one and only Mr. Jay Stewart. Jay, thank you for coming on the show.
Hi guys, how are you?
We're great. We are absolutely great, mate. How about yourself? Because I can imagine this is something that if you're ever going to get interviewed about, you might not think that somebody wants to interview me about that season of Survivor that I randomly did about 15 years ago. I'm sure this has probably never happened before.
Surprise.
Yeah, which must make it interesting given your unique body of work that you have done. And we're going to go over some of what you have done over the years, that there are some of these shows that I guess would stand out to certain fan communities. Now, do you kind of find that every now and then you will get a group of fans or somebody who wants to talk to you about one of these shows that maybe you've even forgotten you've even done?
Yeah, actually, it's normally the ones you least expect, although Survivor being such a brand, such a massive worldwide hit, this is not so surprising. But a show I did called The Mole, I don't know whether any of you might have seen that, but I often get people asking me for ringtones of the theme or, can I send them some of the music from it, because it was such a unique and unusual show. There's some fans of that show.
Well, we spoke to David Mason at the beginning of this season, and he, of course, behind The Mole, and we spoke to him in that interview about watching The Mole. I basically got into Survivor because I loved The Mole, and that of transitioned me into watching US Survivor, and it kind of picked up from there. So I remember it vividly, The Mole, and of course the first season filmed in my home state of Tasmania. So there's lots of connections there, Jay, that are fond memories of The Mole.
Yeah, good.
Which it must then kind of getting that connection when you get the potential to do a season of Survivor. I'd love to learn how that opportunity came about. How do you end up getting the gig of doing Survivor, Celebrity Survivor, of course, when ultimately it ends up on Channel 7?
Yeah, well, David Mason, who you just mentioned, was one of my best clients at the time. I first met him doing an Australian show called Who Dares Wins. And he went on from there, and he had another partnership. They split, and he went to work for Channel 7, and he took over there and got the opportunity to produce The Mole, and he asked me to write the music for it. And at that stage, I knew nothing of the show. In fact, I don't think the world did. It originated in Belgium, and the very first season worldwide was a Belgian version, and David really took that concept and turned it into The Mole that we saw in Australia, which is very, very different. It's a lot more Survivor-ish, if you like, than the Belgian version, which was a little more, low key. So yeah, that was a great series to work on. Back in the day, we were using VHS tapes, and the internet was in its fledgling years, and I actually had cabs arriving at my home at 3 a.m. in the morning, delivering me the latest episode so that I could sit there through the night writing the music. So yeah, that was old school.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one thing, I guess, I mean, I don't understand what goes on with being a composer and doing all the music. So you write the music after you see the episodes? Is that basically how or do you have a general idea of what type of music you're going to be sort of composing?
Well, they're really two different questions, but the first one's really interesting because when I first started composing music, yes, we got the opportunity to write to the pictures. So they would cut the episode, they would get it to a stage which was called a final lock-off, where no one was going to change a second here or a second there or edit something in and out. And then I'd be the last chain in the link and they'd send it to me. I would already have some ideas in mind. David, for instance, or any director or producer would tell me the style of music. We would have established that at the beginning. But once I got the show, I had the palette, if you like, and then I could write to the pictures, try to highlight the exciting points or anything that needed to be highlighted. And but these days it's very different. So I work on the show called The Block here in Australia, and previously My Kitchen Rules. And those shows are completely different. I supply them with a suite of tracks and they decide where the music should go. So in the 15 years that I've been doing it, it's completely changed around.
Do you have a preference of which of those methods you like as a composer? Because I could maybe imagine when you're watching an episode that's sent to you and you can write as you go along, that might make it more of a raw, live sound rather than just pre-composed music, which then they have to find a way to fit into a certain scene.
Ultimately, the preference is always to write to vision, because that's how composers really get inspired to come up with different things. They help the narrative of the story. But it depends on the program, if I can be very honest with you. A show like Survivor was fantastic. Our one was filmed in Vanuatu. The scenery was incredible. The stunts were amazing. So that was a joy to write music to the pictures. Another show I worked on was The Force here in Australia, which was a factual show of police running around the countryside, busting hardened criminals and etc. That was also very exciting. A show like My Kitchen Rules, where you're watching people in a kitchen cooking for 5 hours, I'm more than happy for them to put the music on the program.
So when you get the call up to do Celebrity Survivor,
yeah,
I mean, obviously that's I'm assuming you're excited to do it.
Yeah.
You said you weren't a Survivor fan or not much knowledge of the show. Did you straight away go back and listen to the American version and say what? Because Ancient Voices, like, it's such an iconic theme for Survivor, but what happened? Like, did you go and listen to it? And of course you can't copy that. So what were your thoughts going into composing the Celebrity season?
Look, that's really interesting. I'll never forget this situation because we in Australia don't have the budgets that they do in America. And when I first got the opportunity to do this, the first thing that scared me was my budgets. I did a bit of research on the American composer and realized that he actually traveled to the very countries where they were filmed, ran around with a microphone and recorded natives singing, and all of a sudden I've been asked to do the music for this show from my home studio with no money. And that American theme is epic. It's absolutely huge. It really is. So and there was one other complication, if I can share with you, and you would know the story behind this more than I would because my memory's failing me. But the Celebrity of Survivor format, the one that we had the rights to, came out of England. And Simon Cowell might have owned it. I can't remember. Whereas the American version, which is a Survivor that we all know in Australia, was owned by another arm of the company. So when we were given the rights here in Australia to make Celebrity Survivor, we got the British rights to use their music, their format, the way that they were doing the show. So I don't know whether this makes sense to you guys, but anyway, Channel 7 got a whole lot of music from British Survivor, which they were permitted to use on the show should they choose to. It was so unrecognizable to the American version, which is the version we all grew up on. So that David turned around to me and Channel 7 said, look, okay, well, we bought this version, but we want it to sound like that version, and we're not going to pay you much to do it. So, so I'm losing my train of thought, but if I can continue, I remember I dragged my friends in the studio where I made them sing like natives. I made them scream. I sampled it backwards, and we banged sticks together. We did everything we could to try to create the sound of Vanuatu, And it was a challenge. It was a challenge to create a soundscape that was somewhere close to the American version.
So when you're doing this, and you said you're bringing your mates in, you're coming up with these chants, like time wise, like are you under the pump? We heard that this all happened very quickly when Channel 7 decided to run this celebrity season. It was on such a tight, time schedule. How long would you normally take to compose a theme like this, and how long did you have for this one?
The theme wasn't so bad because they were aware that they were going to make the show, and they were aware they wanted a grand, big theme with native chanting and things. So I probably had maybe a month to think about the theme. And in the process of writing a theme for any TV show, it's generally the piece of music that the television networks are most all over. So you would submit multiple versions of a theme and multiple demos before that they would approve where it was going to. But in reference to David's comments, we actually made the show in very, very quick turnaround. And that's where I referenced the cabs arriving to my home. I remember that episode 1, I was still writing the music the night before it went to air. Wow. So the cab would arrive, and there were several cabs that arrived through the night with as they finished editing a segment, they'd put it in a cab, send it to my house. I would sit there writing the music for it. And then at 6 a.m. in the morning, where after 3 loads of cabs and the whole show was complete, I'd rush it back to Channel 7 and they'd throw it on the show and put it to air that night. Wow. So the making of the show was very, very tight. Yeah.
That's crazy to think that that's kind of happening all in that process and everything along those lines. I mean, how many versions of the theme did you actually do before they kind of signed off on the final version that we heard on the season?
I can't remember for sure, but I think it was about 2 or 3 different versions. But this is very typical, we would have written a few ideas, and generally how we deal with this is I send them 3 or 4 different ideas at the same time. And then they go, well, this one is close to what we want, and we like that from this one, and can you put them all together? And that's pretty much how this theme came apart.
Do you try to keep the versions similar, or are they completely different?
We try to make them a little bit different, but they all had the same ingredients. They had the native chanting, they had the orchestral big sound at the beginning. They all started with a conch, horn blow. Now, these were significant things that Channel 7 wanted to retain from the American style of theme. But just between you guys and all your listeners, if they ever hear this theme, I have no idea what the chanting means. I think it's just all garbled nothing.
Well, there's that question gone. All right, just cross that one out.
Well, I was going to say, Jay, we now know that the chanting wasn't the people from Vanuatu. They were just a couple of mates in your garage chanting whatever they wanted. Probably had a few beers under their belt.
In fact, a funny story. I also, a lot of the sound effects, because the way the show was, and I might be jumping ahead here, but the background of the show, particularly when you see them just in the campsite and it's not active, there was music all the way through that, and it'd be very, very low key, but there'd be native sounds, wood blocks clicking and natives wailing in the background. And if there was a shot of the moon, you'd have a female native sound, and it was very emblematic of that type of show. So I supplied those to Channel 7 so they could add some of those on later. And I didn't change the names to anything really sexy. So the male chanter's name was Bryden. And they used to laugh at Bryden. That doesn't sound like a native. I should have changed it to, I don't know, some native Vanuatu name, but I didn't.
But did you have an actual name? Like we know the Americans they called it Ancient Voices. Did you actually have a name for the theme song?
No, it was never released outside of the TV show, so we didn't name it. It was just Australian Celebrity Survivor theme. Yeah.
Did you ever?
What year was it? Can you remind
2006.
me? Wow.
Was. Yeah. Did you or were you aware of the Channel 9 version? And if you were aware, had you heard the theme that they had done from that version at all?
The most recent series.
The one that the other Australian version that had aired, just the only other Australian one that had aired before the season.
Yeah, I was aware of it. I didn't pay much attention to it, only because you don't want to get too influenced by, you asked a question before that I forgot to answer, and that was, how can you make it sound not the same, And that's a challenge for us composers all the time, because clients want something that evokes the sound of a previous theme, but it can't sound the same. That's copyright infringement. So that's one of the big challenges. So the least amount of external influences I had before I wrote the theme, the better for me.
Which, it's interesting to hear that, because the reason I sort of bring up the Channel 9 version is a lot of criticisms from fans. A lot of people weren't happy when they did an Australian version that they didn't have Ancient Voices, they didn't have the Russ Landau and David Vanacourt themes. And a lot of people were very critical that the Whalers Way song didn't sound anything like the US Survivor one. Whereas your theme, I mean, straight away from the chant at the beginning before it gets into the like it automatically, you are connected to Ancient Voices. It's got that very similar sound, and as you said, without obviously trying to completely rip off that. Is it a case of, without being overly influenced, as you said, you don't want to simply copy another person's theme, but you can understand what they're going for? Do you kind of just have like a listen and go, okay, cool, I've got the gist of what I need to do, and basically go from there?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good assessment. I mean, we just took the elements of Ancient Voices, which was the chanting. It was very, very, very strong. The pace of it, the big orchestral background that builds towards the end, they were clear for us. We can't do without those. So we had to start with those elements and write something that was essentially different. But if you're using those elements, we were always hoping that the fans would be connected.
One thing that Jack Robin said, which stood out to me, is the daunting fact for him about writing a theme for a show like Survivor, which even at that early point when he wrote it was a very iconic show and an iconic theme for yourself. 6 years into the US journey at that point, a lot longer than Jack had. Jack sort of compared it to if all of a sudden they did an Australian version of The Simpsons and you had to completely rewrite the iconic theme for The Simpsons. A very daunting task for a very well-known song. As a composer, do you think about things like that, or is it a case of you have to black that out in your mind and just get to the job at hand, essentially?
No, you always, especially with that show, especially that theme, it's such a great theme. And you're always aware that you're going to do something that's always going to be for the fans of the show, and always going to be a little, never quite come up to the mark. You have to expect that, You're always going to be writing something that they recognize the previous version. And that just goes along with anything we do. But unfortunately, it's more of a contractual thing. Otherwise, and maybe some of the producers you've spoken to might have cleared this up, but they would use the theme if they could. They're just contractually not allowed to.
Were you ever? Your theme does. It's brilliant. We absolutely love your theme. We talk it up all the time. It does obviously sound very Pacific Island sort of. It's got that tone, obviously, with the chanting and all that. Was there ever any concern that if they did a second season, would you have to change up the theme? Was there ever any talk about, well, this show might become really popular with the celebrity version, that we'll have to do it in different locations, meaning the theme would have to sound different?
No, we never discussed that. I think we're just so against time to get this show done. And generally in Australia, you never know whether you're going to go a second season or not. But we were always assuming in the back of our minds that it would be filmed in Fiji or Vanuatu or somewhere close, and hopefully that theme would work in those locations.
When you talk about sort of getting some mates and Braden and all that kind of stuff to come in and do the chanting, do you have to know some mates who are good at chanting, or is it literally just a couple of guys? Hey, how do you sound when you make the sound? How do you go through the process of working out which of your mates can do these chants?
Well, I use professional singers.
Right.
So
okay, good to know.
They were comfortable in that environment, and we just made them grunt and groan until we liked what they came up with. But I'm not necessarily talking about the theme now. That was more of a structured idea about how the chant would go. It has a sort of a rhythm to it and a repetitive nature. So with the theme, we had a really clear idea of how we wanted that to go. But there's a lot of chanting that goes on throughout the show itself. And we let them just channel their inner native.
One thing that fascinated me when we interviewed Jack Robin was when we talked to him about what instruments were used in the theme, and he used, there was a penny whistle and I think like some Irish bloody drum. Yeah. His wife was actually the one singing, like the chanting in the background. So it was quite amazing. So what instruments were used in your theme?
Okay, so we used a conch sample, which is a native shell that you can blow through. That basically became the call, the very opening sound you hear. As you know, the natives were professional singers here from Australia. We use sample libraries a lot as composers because we don't have a lot of budget. So the orchestra were samples. And I have a team of guys that work behind me that are experts in that type of thing. So the way that I work is that I'm a piano player by trade. I compose it, and then I hand it over to the experts that can make sample libraries sound like huge orchestras. And so, yeah.
So are you playing the other instruments as well?
I'm playing the everything that's generated by a keyboard. So the violins, the drums are samples, what they call samples. So essentially a recording of big drums. Like there's Takio drums in there, which are huge Japanese drums. There are the normal timpanis. There are large toms, and they're samples, and you play them on your keyboard. I don't know if this makes sense. So yeah, so I'm essentially playing everything there, and then I send it to someone who's what they call an orchestrator, and he adds the sounds in that make it sound more realistic. So it makes it sound more like an orchestra.
So how many different instruments are you capable of playing on your piano, essentially?
Everything that you can imagine.
Wow.
So the modern composer has the whole, every instrument possible at his fingertips because of sample library technology. So, and in fact, it's big business these days. So the London Symphonic Orchestra, for instance, has just recorded themselves and put it into a format where us composers can buy it and play them on our keyboard to create the symphonic sound. And they charge a license fee for that. And that's their way of making some extra money apart from their recording.
So this is fascinating, Ben. I don't know about you. I had no idea you could do all this on a keyboard. And I assume that he actually had a couple of Japanese guys in there doing these, in there with his mates, with Braden and all that. I just assume that's what Jay was doing, but apparently not. It was all on the keyboard.
All I know that from is Ferris Bueller's Day Off when he starts playing on it to the vomit sounds. That's all I know. So, I mean, here we go. It's evolved a lot from the days of the 80s when Matthew Broderick's making vomit sounds basically to, what was it, chopsticks or whatever it was.
I mean, I can only speak for Australian composers, but television, which is the poorer cousin of film, doesn't have the budgets to hire and record orchestras. So we almost all TV music that you hear will have this kind of technology behind it.
Which, I mean, I can imagine that's what you're saying about the budget. If you had the budget, if Channel 7 had said to you, here's a blank checkbook, Jay, you do what you want. You're going to go out there and you're going to go get the Japanese guys to play the drums. You're going to get the horns and the Vanuatuan tribe members to do all that, aren't you?
Yeah, of course. Although, I will say this, and I've only read this, and I haven't ever spoken directly to Hans Zimmer. Do you know who Hans Zimmer is?
Indeed, yeah, about to do the new Bond movie whenever we eventually get to see it.
Absolutely. He's just like our idol. We all love Hans. Anyway, he's got the budgets and he's got the access to the orchestras, and he still uses some of the sample technology because it creates a more lush and more interesting, complex sound for him.
So when you're putting together all these layers in through your keyboard, in terms of sort of like a multi-track session, are you just kind of laying down one track as like the violin, another track or something like that? Do you send them separately to your mixer you were talking about before? Do you kind of compress it all into one? Kind of what works that way when you're trying to mesh these ideas all together to come up with one audio file?
Sure. Okay, so this might be a little technical for your listeners, but we'll go through it roughly. I will compose a track as a full mix. So as I compose it, it's true. It's instrument by instrument, as you described. You put the cellos, you put the basses down, you put the violas down, you'll add the Japanese drums until you've got your full mix. When I supply it to my producers, the television shows, I supply them the full mix and also cut down versions of that mix. So they might just get the drums, they might just get the violins. And so that when they're producing the show, they've got the flexibility a little bit themselves to decide on how they're going to use the music. They can use the full on, all the kitchen sink, or they can use the smaller version, or they can just use the drums. And this gives them some kind of creative license over how they use the music.
And it also comes down to, I can imagine, with certain pieces that, I don't know if it's the TV network requests it, or you're just sort of used to working in television, you know how it works, that certain pieces, I can imagine, have to fit a certain time frame, particularly with a theme, for example. Yeah. Obviously, an introduction to credits is going to be a certain length, and in 2006, it's going to be a little bit different to what it is in 2020. So I can imagine Channel 7 provides you with some parameters of the length of pieces you've got to provide.
Yeah, absolutely. The theme is always a set length. And the end credits, we always make an open-ended version so that we can edit that, because sometimes the end credits would be different every night on some shows. These days, I lament the loss of the theme. Networks don't make shows with big themes anymore because in their eyes, it wastes airtime. Whereas I just love the standard theme, like the Survivor theme. It says, here we are, put the kettle on, get the beer, and we'll watch the show. Whereas these days, the show starts straight away. There might be 10 seconds or 5 seconds of a music idea and it's all over.
Yeah, it is a real shame with that because, yeah, sort of mentioning The Simpsons before. I mean, you can list 101 different television iconic themes, really. And name one more recent TV show with an iconic theme. There's very few.
Very few. I must say that sorry.
No, you go, Jay. I'll go after you.
I'll just say that my perspective is an Australian perspective. You still hear the great shows coming out of the States that have themes like House of Cards, etc., etc.
So you literally just took the words out of my... I should have jumped in before you, Jay. Now it looks like I'm just joining the bandwagon. I was actually going to say that might be the case in Australia, but in America with these big TV shows where we're seeing these big actors actually do these shows now, one of the main things they have is a big theme. One that I love, I don't know if you've heard of the show called Black Sails. It was a Michael Bay, he produced it, but unbelievable theme to it. And it's just, they've got the works, like the whole orchestra, everything, the drums. You look at something like Game of Thrones, like it's just, these are really big intros. And I think over in America, it's obviously different here, but to get the audience in, they almost have to have that big intro. Yeah,
no, I agree with you. And I miss it here in Australia. I mean, every show in America that I can think of, you mentioned Seinfeld, I believe, Modern Family, for instance, and even the Netflix shows that are coming out now, they have great themes, but also great visuals in their intros. And it's almost like a little work of art. And they're always around 30 seconds long, or sometimes longer. And it really does brand the show. And the way Netflix get around it very cleverly is that, as you know, once you've watched 2 or 3 series and you're on to episode 4 or 5, if you want to skip the thing, you can. It gives you the option.
Yeah.
But it's always there. And it's a shame we don't do it here.
I'll tell you one theme I never skip, and that's your theme for Celebrity Survivor. Like that, I just wanted to admit that right then. It's it's probably the best part of the episode is bang, you hear your theme and it sucks you in every time.
And how are you watching this show from 2006?
Well, it is actually on True Stories on YouTube in terms of the Survivor, the Castaway Productions actually have started sort of an official YouTube channel and they've actually put it up there. So it's now legally completely available to watch it now, which is I think when we've been doing this podcast, it's been great that we've been able to have people who either didn't watch it at the time or haven't seen it in 15 years kind of join along and watch it, because prior to this going on, there was a couple of bootleg copies on YouTube that would get pulled down every couple of years, or even just your theme. They would just kind of have Celebrity Survivor intro as a 1 minute clip on YouTube, essentially for those with a flashback, which I'm sure if we looked up half of your themes, there might be an old Who Dares Wins clip and an old Mole clip on YouTube, essentially kind of showing your theme for people who want to hear them.
Who knows? I haven't dug in to find out.
I was going to say, Jay, before you knew you were coming on this podcast, had it been a few years since you had actually heard the theme from Celebrity Survivor?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, this morning when I sent it to you, It was, I just went, oh, that's what that sounded like. In fact, I actually didn't have the hard drive left with all of the stuff from the show. I had to find it on an old audio CD I had and convert it to an MP3 because it was just so long ago.
And do you have sort of the other kind of themes or kind of other pieces of music that you had on that CD?
I do. I have some of the background musics and some of the tension musics I do, and some of the action stuff.
Great. Well, we would love to
I'll
hear it.
I just didn't get time to convert them all this morning.
No, that's fine. Because it's one thing that I'm a big fan of soundtracks for. You talk about movies, Hans Zimmer. John Williams. People like this. Just absolutely. I will download a score from any soundtrack or buy a CD. I love soundtracks and. I'm an absolute nerd with Survivor soundtracks. I pretty much, because for a long time, Russ Landau and David Van Kool will release them on iTunes to purchase. But sort of since they haven't been doing original themes anymore, since I think like season 23, 24, they've just been recycling them and kind of using some newer ones. They don't do them. But I love listening to them kind of almost as background music. They're very relaxing, and when you're actually working, it actually it helps you, I feel, get in the zone. And all of a sudden when something picks up, you've kind of got a challenge music going on, or you've got the blindside music at a tribal council and you're in the middle of doing a project, like, oh, I've got to hurry up now, dun, 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 dun. And it really kind of works. And I think what we've noticed with your score throughout the celebrity version is that it is very close to the US version, a lot closer than the Whalers Way version was. Whalers Way, Channel 9, had a very unique sound. It's got its own piece in Survivor history, but yours really does kind of connect that. Did you watch more Survivor once after this to kind of hear what they sound? Was it something that after you had worked on the show, you all of a sudden wanted to kind of hear a bit more of Russ's and David's work to kind of see how you went compared to what you did?
Probably the opposite. Once I knew that the show was coming to Australia, I watched and researched a lot of what they had done because I believed that we had to try to make it be the little cousin or the baby brother of the US version rather than something completely different. And plus Channel 9 had done their own version as well. So I really wanted to be influenced by them. I read about them. I looked on YouTube on how he created it. Certain parts of the show, like the Tribal Council, that was a really important part of the show that had to sound and feel like you were watching the American version in my eyes.
And did you ever have any communication or want to reach out to Russ or David to maybe either A, get some tips, or B, hey, what do you think of my theme compared to yours?
I didn't approach them. You're always, it's you don't know how people are going to react. You know what I mean? So I just sort of let it go, and hopefully they would have watched it. I don't know.
One quick question just on that too. I've noticed, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, this might be a question to pose to someone at Channel 7, whoever's in control of putting the credits up. It is listed in the credits when it comes to composer, your name as well as Russ Landau's. Do you know why that is the case? Did you use any pieces of Russ's music in any of your music, and maybe they had to kind of credit him just because there was a bit of a motif somewhere that you used? I
actually wasn't aware of that. And no, I don't know why that happened. The music was registered here by our Royalty Society as my music. I always got acknowledged for it and paid for it from a royalty stream as my music. So that generally only happens if you do a co-write with somebody, and that never went there. So it might have been a licensing thing, but I can't say definitely. They might have had to put his name up as a contingency of buying the license to the program. But I don't know. I didn't even know that was the case.
Well, that's interesting, Ben, because you actually asked Russ, and he said he didn't know either.
I did, that is true. I interviewed Russ many years ago on one of our other projects, Survivor Oz, and kind of have remained friends with him. And when I noticed that, and we were kind of researching and sort of trying to track you down, Jay, for the show, I had to ask him, because we were very aware that prior to Channel 10 starting Australian Survivor in 2016 again, no Australian version had ever used Ancient Voices or any of Russ's themes. Russ basically told me he had never had anything to do with any Australian versions. He wasn't aware. He basically explained it kind of maybe, as you just said there, Jay, that it was probably a licensing thing. He said kind of once he composes it, the licensing sort of almost out of his control and they do with it what they do. So he wasn't aware of why his name would have been there and at the same time as well.
Yeah, actually, I would be interested to know that. I'll ask David I'll send him an email, but I never even noticed it or
There's probably a check somewhere just lying around with Russ's name on it that he's never cashed in. It was just maybe in David Mason's drawer, who knows? But now I think about it too, Jay, like you were probably in the hardest position because there'd already been obviously the American version with the iconic Ancient Voices, and there'd already been an Australian version theme song from the Channel 9 season. So here you are, not only have to make it different but similar to the American version, you've also up against, people have already heard another version from the first Australian Survivor, which, there was criticism. We loved that version as well, mind you, but there was a lot of criticism of people saying, and the fans saying, well, that's not Ancient Voices, that's not Survivor, we don't like it. And then here you are in 2006, have got to then make another version. Like, that would have been a lot of pressure as well.
I didn't feel under pressure, but I did feel the significance of the brand. And you feel that you need to live up to, especially the American version. I might have mentioned before that we were given English music to use, which sounded nothing like Survivor. And that was completely different. It was almost electronic. It was weird. And so originally Channel 7 were going to use that music. This is how I came to do the job. They were originally going to use the English music because that was the format they bought. But it sounded so much nothing like Survivor that they brought me in to write the music. I wasn't originally part of the equation. When I came in and they said, well, we don't like the English music and we want it to sound like the American music, that's where I had to take my inspiration from.
So you mentioned earlier that you made like 3 versions of it. I'm assuming, I may be wrong, but I'm assuming that when you hand in, say, 3 versions, there's probably one that you prefer, that one theme that you're like, oh, I hope they pick this one. Was that the case, and was it the one that ended up making it to the show?
It was.
Yeah, and I'm glad it did. It honestly, I think, and I've said this on this podcast before, if there had never been an American version and all of a sudden Survivor comes along and you're the first one that composes it and you come up with this theme, it would still be getting used today. Like, that's how good I think it is, that people would be like, this is Survivor, and any other theme, well, that's not Survivor. This is the one. It really is a great theme.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. I mean, I'd honestly literally forgotten about it. So this is really nice to revisit this. And I'll just share with you when I pulled it out and dusted it off this morning to send it over to you guys. I listened to it and went, gee, I wished I'd have mixed that a bit differently. I would have loved to have that louder. I just went through complete
It never ends. That technical mind, right? You're always kind of listening to it. And I can imagine too, and not just for Survivor, but for any show that you do, when you see it on TV with the titles, with the graphics, that must add an extra element to it. And I mean, with a show like Survivor, where you've kind of got the flashy elements of the title cards of the plays, you've got those really quick flashes of like a tribal torch and people on boats, a shark or something like that in the water. I mean, how do you, as a composer, does that make you feel when you finally get to see that airing on TV?
Oh, look, with a show like Survivor or, The Mole, it was exciting. It's great because the locations were great, the scenery was great, the action was great. So we this is a little bit technical now, but generally, as a rule, film and TV do not overlap. So if you're a television composer, you're a TV composer. If you're a film composer, you're a film composer. The two worlds do not collide very often. There are probably exceptions of it, maybe Netflix with the bigger productions. So for us as a TV composer, to write for grandiose scenery with great action is an absolute joy, and I'm always proud to see those on air. And you mentioned the latest version in Australia. Is it Channel 10 that are doing it?
Yep, Channel 10. Yep.
The music on that show is fantastic. I don't know who does it, but it's really good, and I bet the composer had a great time doing it.
Well, that's the US theme. They've finally gotten the right. So that's
They're
basically
using the US. But it's background music as well. Is that US?
Yeah, most of it. I think there is some original music with it. They've got sort of a little bit more in terms of the dramatic. I think the tribal council music is different, but I'm not sure if it is maybe some of Russ's and David's work that maybe just hasn't made it to air. I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, it definitely. You know, the challenge we have with this podcast, Jay, is that a lot of people don't acknowledge any Australian Survivor seasons prior to Channel 10's version. They like to think, oh, well, Channel 10 have done it right now. Those other versions didn't exist, so who cares about them? But it is great as a Survivor fan who happens to be Australian, and then to see an Australian version to kind of have that connection, because you're right, kind of when that grandiose feel to Survivor, it is almost cinematic when it comes to, and this is a reality show, but that music really adds that element to it. So when you've got that sweeping music, these beautiful locations, these beautiful people out there playing beautiful games, it all adds to that zone. And I mean, look, I've been a fan of Survivor for 20, 21 years, and to this day, I will get goosebumps and stop and listen to Ancient Voices and still feel the same as when I first heard it. It is that such a theme that way and you connect that with a TV show when you hear that music.
Yeah, it's fantastic. The American composers just did a brilliant job. There's two shows that we can never emulate. Amazing Race is another one. Mm-hmm. The music that they use for that show is just phenomenal. The budgets, I would love to, I'd love to see what their budgets were. So everything we do in Australia, when I was doing Australian Survivor Celebrity, the budget was a huge consideration to the level that we could go to reach to try to emulate the American. We just could not do it, but we tried the best we could.
With the chanting and everything, it's sort of listening and re-listening to the theme over and over again. I'm not musically minded at all, Jay. I don't know my violin from my viol or anything like that. But one thing that I was really picking up on and kind of listening to it on repeat before this interview, there's almost like through the chanting, almost like a squeak or a squeal or almost like a scream at every now and then in the background, kind of amongst that chanting. Was that kind of just you add a few little fun little squeals or something that the chanting are happening there, or am I just hearing things when I'm listening to that?
I can't recall what you're actually talking about.
Jay, it was probably
a beautiful accident.
Your dog probably wandered into the garage and one of your mates bloody stepped on it and the screen. You're like, oh yeah, we'll put that in.
Well, we did throw everything at that theme, so I wouldn't be surprised if we had, little screams and female, trails of live screaming in there.
I need to find the sound, sort of the timestamp on that one. But I mean, how many of the chant, like how many guys do you have in there kind of doing it? Is it just one guy? Is it just Braden, or is there kind of a group of people?
Bryden, there was Bryden and Damien, they're also composers and they work with me on many of the shows that I'm doing. In fact, at the moment, we've just formed a new music production company together, so it's an exciting new venture for me. But they were both singing on that, and we just multi-tracked it over and over and over.
Were any of them involved in the Who Dares Wins lyrics or the Better Homes and Gardens lyrics?
Yes. Bryden Stace, his name is. He actually, a bit of background to Bryden. He currently lives in London, but he's an Australian singer who is behind the Voice series here in Australia.
Yep.
So when you see the Voice judges here and they're coaching their voices to the ultimate prize, Bryden's really the one behind the scenes that's picking the songs, doing the arrangements, helping the kids learn the songs. So he's a phenomenal singer. He lives in London now. He's also a great composer. He wrote and sang Who Dares Wins. So
Great.
we co-wrote that, and he sang all the lyrics on it. Better Homes and Gardens, my wife sung that.
Oh, there you go.
I'm married to a Kiwi singer, pop singer called Kim Hart, and she sung the theme to that.
Well, you're talking about iconic themes, and I think an iconic theme is one that you get stuck in your head. Now, I probably haven't watched Who Dares Wins in over 20 years, but I can automatically hear the song, and I can hear the Who Dares. Yeah, and then Better Homes and Gardens. I've never really watched it, I'll be honest. It wasn't really my favourite show. But again, I know that getting so much, like you just know it.
Keep going, Ben. Keep going. Come on.
No, I've had enough. I'll leave that to Jay's wife.
But I must clarify this in case you talk to one of my compatriots. There's a fabulous composer here in Australia called Neil Sutherland, And he wrote the Better Homes and Gardens theme for the first 10 years of its life or so. And then I wrote the theme for the last 10 years of its life.
Right.
So you're actually singing his theme then.
Okay. Sorry, I'll pay him some royalties. I'll send him a check.
He's a great guy, so you might run across him at some point.
And you do the block as well. Now, Block, I haven't watched it in ages. I remember, I don't know, was it the first season or the second season? They had that Here Comes Another One song.
That's right,
yeah, and they've changed that now, have they? Or
yeah, so that's been a victim of the no theme policy in Australia. So they don't use any theme now in the latest version.
Right.
That was, but our company, myself and Bryden and Damien, we write the tension and drama music for that show. So that show uses a lot of radio music, a lot of current hits, but occasionally they'll need it to be dramatic or something, and happens with an atmosphere, or something comedic happens and we supply them with that music.
I have to ask this, Jay. Like, it sounds like Bryden's doing very well for himself. Does he ever ring you and say, "Jay, get over here. You need to start chanting something for me"? Like, if to get you back. Like, you gave him the call to say, "Hey, come over and start chanting for Celebrity Survivor." Like, has he ever given you the call? Well, is there anything weird he's ever got you to come over and do?
No, he was living in Australia for most of the time. He's only recently relocated to London, so he's always been here. But no, he's been with me from day one as a co-composer and also as a collaborator in a lot of my television work. We've only just formalised that in a new company just recently.
Nice. It's good to know that Delta Goodrem and Boy George and all that are just kind of pretty faces. They're not doing any work on that show. They're getting paid a lot of money.
It's all Bryden.
I'm sure they contribute a lot to the show, but there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work that he has to do. So someone has to take the kids and teach them the song and edit it and do all that. I don't think the celebrities have time for that.
No.
So we've talked a lot about the theme, and the other big part of Survivor is always the tribal council music. Now, I know this is 15 years ago, but do you remember the music you used for the tribal council part of the show?
I can vaguely, yes.
Yeah, because that was, it's sort of like, Ben, we talked about this recently.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I thought you were going to ask me it anyway, so I jumped in there, mate. It's kind of almost like an ocarina-y pan flute kind of pipe sort of flute sound. I mean, kind of I was talking up recently in one of our episodes about how I really like the sound of it. It's kind of got a unique sort of feel to it. I mean, I guess that was your vibe in putting that together like that?
Yeah, we got a lot of flute samples from an African a CD that had come out at the time. It was very popular amongst composers, and they're royalty-free samples that you can use in any way you like. So they're African flutes that we use, and you can't control. They're more like you press the key down and it just plays. So you don't really control the direction of the tones or the tempos of them. In those days, they were just pre-recorded little samples. So we wrote the music around those samples to fit in how they work.
But so that theme, though, would have actually been similar to something that was on a sample from this African CD?
No, the flutes were the sample, just the solo flute. And all of the rest of it, I believe from memory, we used a timpani, or at least a bass drum, an orchestral bass drum as a slow pulse, to have that tribal element sort of going through. I believe we used some choral samples and some orchestral samples, but the flute was the thing that gave it that floaty feeling, and that was the sample. So we created the music and wrote the music around that sample, if that makes sense.
As Matt sort of alluded to there, outside of the theme, the tribal council music is probably up there as being just as important, because I know for a good 23, 24 seasons of the US version, they had a theme called Tally the Vote, which is probably up there as alongside the theme as one of my favorite pieces of music from Survivor, because it's just synonymous with tribal council. Yeah. And sort of you're writing music in a period of Survivor where it's not as dramatic. They're not going over the top so much now, where they're expecting a blindside every tribal council. Yeah. Someone's going to play an idol. That's what's expected now, whereas in 2006, it's not as expected. So it's kind of, you're not having to do that real over-the-top dramatic feel that Channel 10 love. You've kind of almost got a peaceful, relaxing, but somewhat dramatic score that's going on while people are getting voted out.
Yeah, that's a good assessment of it. I hadn't thought about it like that, but it is a little more peaceful, a little bit more relaxing. The producers just wanted it to sound. It's obviously at night, always at night, our version, and they just wanted it to sound atmospheric. And that was the main thing that I had. They said we want it to sound tribal-esque, obviously. We want it to sound atmospheric, and we wanted to be able to pause at certain moments and have some accents when they turn over and reveal who they voted for.
You mentioned before about how you were still writing basically prior to that first episode. Did you then have to keep doing that for every single week, or at that point did you just bank a bunch and just send it to them so that they could use it for the rest of the season?
So before we were talking about the mole as a fast turnaround, but with Survivor, we created them a library of tracks that they could use initially to put in the right places. So, Jay, we like this track here. The third track on CD4, we've put it here. And then they would give it to me at the end and say, okay, can this is our indication of the roadmap. And can you now flesh it out and create the score for us?
Did you mentioned before, sort of say like with a block, you will have a dramatic piece, a comedic piece, things like that. Similar thing for Survivor. Do you have to create like a comedic piece if they've got something funny, a little bit, lighthearted, and then those dramatic pieces as well?
Yeah, no, we didn't do any comedic pieces for Survivor, but there was a lot of atmospheric stuff. I mean, as you recall, they wandered around the campsite a lot, and there was a lot of shots at night sitting around fire, And in the show, we used what they call wall-to-wall music, which is basically there is no gaps. So, that's not so common these days, but in those days, you wouldn't leave a gap.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because it's kind of, I don't even know if US Survivor has always done that, but it is kind of, I don't want to say noticeable in a bad way, because it's not in a bad way when I say it's noticeable on the Channel 7 version. The Channel 10 version does it a lot too. It's sort of, it's noticeable with that. But is that extra challenging when you're kind of doing that wall-to-wall music, that you've kind of always got to have it to fit throughout the episode? Or is that just part of the job? That's kind of what you're used to. That's kind of what you're expected to do. So you no questions asked, you just do it. Yeah,
at that stage, it was what we were expected to do. It's not that challenging in the sense that a lot of the music in that section can be very atmospheric. It can be very easy to compose. It's not all as say there's a challenge. That music was very intensive. It took a long time to write and a long time to get it right. Whereas just a slight atmospheric pad with a little flute wailing and a few clap sticks, that took very little time to do.
Do you know, and again, this is maybe testing the memory a little bit because it has been 15 years, do you know how many pieces in total you would have actually written for the entire season?
I can't remember exactly, but my contracts were all fairly similar. And I would say that it would have been around 120. Yeah, it wouldn't be less than 120 pieces of music that you'd write for a series like that.
Wow.
Sometimes more.
What about when the first episode finally goes to air? Do you recall what the reaction was? Did you hear what people were saying about the theme? Did they like it? Did they not?
No, I don't recall. I was a little nervous about it because obviously, it had big shoes to fill. So, we mainly focused on, back in those days, we mainly focused on the ratings. We were more worried about who was watching it, rather than what they thought about the theme. And thank God Twitter wasn't around in those days, because I didn't have to see people tweeting about how poor the theme was.
Which I think, back then, gosh, I didn't know MySpace was around in 2006. I think that might have just been around that period, wasn't it?
It was around. MySpace was the first biggie, yeah.
I'll just say, Ben, though, that people with the very first season 1, Whalers Way, there was criticism of that theme. I've never heard anyone criticize season 2's music.
See, to me, it's always it was always the season that basically people would say it did a better job than Channel 9 did. They thought it was a lot closer to the US version, but then people were like, but it's not quite there. And that's kind of what I've said a lot throughout our coverage of this season, that it is kind of that bridging season between very old school Channel 9, which, differs a lot from the US one on many levels, between the Channel 10 version that ultimately is almost a carbon copy of the US version. So I think that from what I have heard through fans over the years is that while they don't absolutely love the theme like they will with Ancient Voices, they will say, oh, well, that was a lot closer to what we were expecting, because it is very, as we've said sort of throughout this interview and a lot, that it is a lot closer sounding to Ancient Voices than Jack Roban's theme was in Whalers Way.
In all fairness to Jay, though, I don't know what more could have been done, to be honest. Like, without literally copying Ancient Voices, like maybe get Bryden to chant a little louder. I don't know, but literally, I honestly don't know what more could have been done.
Can I tell you that as a composer, when you're asked to do something like this, you would be more than happy for them to use the original theme, because you know how important that is for the show. I would have been happy just to write the background music and the challenge music and the council music and use the theme. And Channel 7 would have been thrilled to be able to use the theme. We just weren't allowed to.
Yeah. Which you mentioned before about how you get people contacting you about, hey, like I want the mole theme as a ringtone or things like that. Jack was talking a little bit about how his theme was being sold as a ringtone, and I remember that. I remember getting the TV week when you send in a text, you get $3, you get your polyphonic ringtone, and I remember when the Australian Survivor theme was a ringtone. How did that work? Like, did you ever get like hey, Jay, let's use your theme as a polyphonic ringtone, or like how did that work back then when that offer would come about to sell it as a ringtone?
Yeah, well, so it didn't happen on my Survivor theme. I don't think, listening to it this morning again and reminding myself, I don't think it was that melodic that you could actually use it as a ringtone. It was more of we put more of an accent on the chant, and whereas the American version had a definite melodic and a definitely choral sound to it. Whereas the mole, people would often ask, could they have it as a ringtone? And I would just send it in, because in those days you didn't even think about the commercial use of a ringtone.
Well, I just want to point out, Matt, before you go in, just to point out that you don't think it sounds as a ringtone. This is legitimately not a setup. I want to prove to you that this is legitimately my ringtone right now on my phone. So if you ring me right now, you're going to hear your theme. I might need to pay you some money for this, Jay, but
you're using a recording of it.
Yeah, well, this is kind of the one that I got off YouTube before you sent me that one in today. So maybe I need to change it up. But no, it works. Trust me, my phone's ringing and I answer.
Well, this is how old school I am, and I'm sorry for your listeners who can't remember that, but the phones in those days, they didn't have the ability to play MP3s.
No, yeah.
They had to convert it into an actual tone.
Yep.
It's all right, Jay. I've still got the Crazy Frog as my ringtone. No, not really. That was like 20 years ago. But about your thing, like you did mention, like it definitely builds up. Like it sort of gets big at the end, obviously with the chanting and all that. It has that real build up to the end, to this like epic finish. And you mentioned like the Amazing Race earlier. I think of the American Amazing Race, like that just bang, it starts out like just epic right from the very beginning. But I guess there's two ways of doing it, isn't it? Like with the Amazing Race thing, that's how they did it. They started out epic, where yours was that slow build up to what I think was a really great finish and sets you up for what is to come for the episode. Yeah. I mean, it had to have a build to it. It had to have a crescendo. I can't remember the footage behind what they used, but there was a volcano or something, wasn't there? Yeah. They have the volcano. They show shots of the vine jumping, the locals doing the vine jumping. A lizard. They do the lizard with its tongue out. Whoever did that up, brilliant. Like it with the music and that background, fantastic.
Yeah.
No Dicko though. I'm sad there wasn't a Dicko in the intro.
I mean, I'm sure the US were over in Vanuatu a fair bit, weren't they?
They did season 9. They filmed in Vanuatu, which is, I believe, about 2 or year and a half before the celebrity one was there, and use a lot of the same sort of cultural elements and everything as well. But I mean, Matt's talking about that build up, and kind of that I think relates into where there is that real similar vibe to Ancient Voices, because it's that French horn kind of build up in Ancient Voices. It leads into that epic crescendo of how that ends with the title theme on your screen, the logo. And that's exactly how it connects with yours, when you've kind of got the ending of it and then boom, Celebrity Survivor, and then it kind of transitions straight into the opening bit. Which, I mean, do you find those pieces are the most fun to write, where you're talking about kind of almost that cinematic feel to it, when you can really build it up into this sweeping sound and kind of just end it really quickly on a dramatic note that it kind of just sticks with you?
Yeah, I mean, the orchestral ones are always the most fun to write. It's also a challenge for us because we're not using orchestras. So, as I mentioned before, we're using technology to create that. But they're always the most. Look, we're always driven, as composers, we're always, especially television or film composers, we're driven by the narrative of the picture. So when the picture is grand and you get the opportunity to match that with the music and push the story of the picture along, the narrative, that's when it's really exciting, when the two things come together.
Has there been another project that you've worked on that you can compare to kind of that grand scale that Survivor was?
Not in that way, but I really liked The Force here in Australia. It was a factual TV show I mentioned before. They gave us that was budgets were okay for that show. They gave us the opportunity to write to the picture. We got to use a lot of music that you might tend to hear more in film work. A lot more inspired by the Hans Zimmer movie style of writing. And that was a lot of fun to write for that.
Matt's a cop in his day job, so I'm trying to picture sort of, you being able to write a theme and a score to Matt working as a. I can send you some footage from his first episode of Survivor. He'll tell you that he's a cop in that episode.
I do remember that show, The Force. I can't. Do you know what year that would have sort of aired?
They only stopped putting it on air last year.
Do you know when it started?
12 years prior to 2019.
Wow.
That's why I remember it, because I've been in the job 12 years. So I remember when I was sort of going through the recruit stage and all that was on. So I do clearly remember. I can't remember the theme music to it or the music, but I do remember that show when it was on when I was going through the academy. Yeah.
You're coming out of Brisbane, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So I don't think we used. It wasn't filmed in Brisbane. I think we filmed it in New South Wales and WA.
You did. Yeah. It wasn't Queensland Police.
Matt,
No.
you could have lasted longer on a TV show.
I know.
I don't think you're going to get voted out of being the cop this time. So you might have done okay. Jay, did you end up watching Celebrity Survivor? Did you kind of, if you did, you remember kind of watching it and thinking what you thought of the gameplay and everything else that happened in it?
I look, prior to writing. This may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but as TV composers, you generally don't watch a lot of television outside of what you're working on because you're so involved. So I'd only seen the show casually up until the time I got the opportunity to write for the show, and then I watched it and researched it prior to, and kept an eye on it afterwards to see. I love the music. I love the composer in the show. I know you've spoken to him before on this program, and I always wanted to just check in and see what he was doing because obviously for the first 12 or 13 or 15 episodes, he got to go to the countries and research the local, and every season sounded different, which I really liked. So I enjoyed the show.
Because I can imagine, as Matt was sort of saying before, had they continued on and kind of, have those influences, because you're right, like that's what made so much of those earlier US seasons unique, was when each season had its own iteration of the theme. Like the Australian Outback had didgeridoos in it, the African season had African tribal chanting in it, the Thailand season sort of had Thai music in it. Like it made it unique, and unfortunately it's been a long time in the US one since we've had an original season. So I mean, I guess kind of that's the sad fact that ultimately Celebrity Survivor didn't continue on for more than one season, and the budget might have grown, who knows, Dicko's pay might have gotten cut, he might have given you some of the money towards the thing, and you could have gone off to Samoa and Vanuatu and all these places.
Who knows? We can only wonder.
Did you ever get to meet Dicko? You get to hang out with Dicko at all in any of the production parties or anything?
I didn't get to. I was in the room with him. I wouldn't say I met him or spoke to him.
That's all that matters, right? You were in the room with Dicko.
I got to be in the room with Jennifer Hawkins too once. So
Well, that's a tricky one. What would you rather, Dicko or Jennifer Hawkins? That's a little bit tricky.
So Jay, I was going to say, so once Survivor's done and dusted, you've done all the music there. It's all shown. What sort of went next? Like what's happened over the last 15 years? Obviously, you said you're in a production company now, and with Bryden and another mate. What have you been doing?
Okay, so I've been very fortunate in my career in that a lot of the shows that I've worked on, unlike Celebrity Survivor, have been long-running shows. So with obviously The Mole, I think The Mole ran for 7 or 8 seasons. My Kitchen Rules, I worked on it. It's just had its last season, which I didn't do, the first one, but I did 10 years of My Kitchen Rules. I've done The Force for 12 years, amongst many other things, little shorter seasons. But The Block now, I've been on that for the last 6 years. And some of the music, some of our music that we've got to do, we produced all the music for Channel 7's News here in Australia. We didn't write it all. The theme's written by John Williams, the famous American composer, but we've written some of the T's music on either side, and we also recorded and reproduced all of his music. So yeah, I've been fortunate enough up until COVID to be very busy. The television industry has brakes on at the moment.
Yes, like a few places. It's fascinating to work on news and doing some of that themes. There was Pendulum. They did a sort of a dance remix version of the ABC News theme, which was actually fantastic. I saw them live, and I swear that was the most popular song they played all night. When all of a sudden you hear the everyone's like everyone's dancing along. Have you ever had anybody remix any of your songs and maybe having like dubstep versions or something like that?
Well, funny you should say that. David Mason and his partner Adrian Brandt, when they were doing Who Dares Wins, Mike Whitney. Do you remember Mike Whitney?
Oh yeah, so Mike legendary Whitney, self, Mike Whitney. Yes.
He used to always say, "This is really frightening stuff." That was his favorite line. So they decided to do a dance version of "This is really frightening stuff," which we really did. And I had a mate who had a record company, and we released it as a single, but I don't think it did very well.
Well, I'm telling you now, Jay, if you're ever bored during this pandemic and want a project to do, we will send you a clip of Ian Dicko Dixon saying, "Play hard, play safe, but play to win." And if you can remix that into something with some dubstep or some dancing going on, you will make our year.
I might have been very bored.
Yes.
In season 1, Jack Robin's theme, they actually did do a remix with the techno version. With the. Do you remember the guy? I can't remember the name.
The guy off the top of my head. I'd have to dig that up. But yeah, no, they kind of it was, and apparently it was just something that I think kind of it happened. But yeah, that remix was fantastic. That is, it was a really interesting take on the Survivor theme.
Yeah, I haven't heard it.
We'll have to send you a copy. I'm actually looking at some of the other stuff you've worked on too. RSPCA Animal Rescue, Comedy Inc. I used to love that show. That was a good show. Do you have a favorite of all the themes and kind of all the shows you've done music for over the years?
Yeah, that's tough because they're all so different. Now you mentioned Comedy Inc., but that was fun to work on because the theme was fun because it was a comedic light style theme, which you don't often get to write here in Australia. But in the body of the show, they did parodies of songs. Mm-hmm. And so we had to write music that sounded like an original track that wasn't the original track, so they could do a parody of it. That was a challenge.
You know, it's funny you mention that because I watched that show so much, and there's one that always stands out, and this is just completely random on the top of my head. There was that song by that Russian girl band Tattoo, that All the Things She Said song, right? Yeah. And I remember it was basically, I think the song went something like money in our bank, every time you wank, because basically the film clip was two teenage girls in school uniforms kissing in the rain. So please tell me you had a say in, like, did you come up with those lyrics, or are you just writing the music in the background?
No, I didn't write any of the lyrics. I just wrote the music. So the comedy team wrote all the lyrics, and then we wrote the music. The job got a lot easier in the later seasons because they found out, obviously they wanted to use the original music. They were very nervous about copyright because you can't just put someone else's music to air without their permission, and you can't. And you can't, like, okay, this is going to be boring, but someone might find this interesting. I can record and release on a record any one song in the world that I want without their permission. So I can record a Beatles song or a Michael Jackson song or a Madonna song and record it on my CD and sell the CD, and I don't ask them permission. But I cannot change one lyric, and I cannot change anything about it. and I have to credit them with the writing of the song. But that's all fair enough, so that they get the royalties. So on television, if you're a comedy writer and you want to change the lyrics, you're now meddling with someone's song.
Right.
So they were very, very scared about the legalities of that. But then someone did some research. I forget how it worked, but you remember Weird Al Yankovic?
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there was a law that they used in the end, which was true, is that provided you were doing a comedy skit, you were permitted to use, you could change the lyrics without asking the permission of the original writers. So then we didn't have to rewrite the song. They could use the background music of the song and just change the lyric, and they weren't infringing copyright. But in the early years, we had to write a new song. That wasn't the song that they were copying. It was a completely different song that sounded like that song.
Wow.
You know what I'm saying? It was quite a challenge, and it was quite fun to do. So that, you know, in the end, a viewer could watch the show and they could go, oh, I see, they're taking a parody of that band. Yeah. But if you actually listen to the song, it wasn't that song. So it was quite a challenge.
That's really fascinating to know because, yeah, I mean, I love parody shows like that. And my favorite parts were always the songs, like whenever they did it. There was another one I remember I think when Danny Minogue had a Neon Lights album out and she kind of basically blended it into the fact that she was sounding so much like a sister that I think you started going the la la la, like Can't Get You Out of My Head, and kind of just, it's so random that I'm remembering these things from like nearly 20 years ago, Jay. Gosh, what do I do with my life? One thing that I would love to know, if right now you had never done Celebrity Survivor, or even if right now they bring it back and they come to you and say, Jay, we want you to do this again, but we want you to redo the theme. How would you do, or would you do anything different with a theme in this time as opposed to 15 years ago?
I think I'd still take the same approach, but I with the technology and the experience that I had in the industry now, I think I would have produced it better, and I would have, but I would have still taken the same approach. I think that there's only one way of solving that puzzle. And I think it has to be done in a similar way.
It's really an amazing theme that, you know, you might think we're just blowing smoke up your ass. We're sucking up to you because you're on the show. And maybe we are. Let's be honest. We secretly hate the theme. It's terrible. We're going to rubbish you as soon as we go off air. But in all seriousness, it is such a great theme that really does stand the test of time. And I think what, you know, as I said before, what we're trying to do on this show is obviously acknowledge the previous versions of Australian Survivor before the Channel 10 version, but also acknowledge the effort and everything that went into the productions of this show. Because as we've always said, no matter what people may think about those versions in the final product, there were lots of people working on these shows. There were 16 players on one, 12 on another, but it's not just the players. In season one, you had more than 100 production staff working on this season. You know, you had countless people working on this season. So you've all spent countless hours putting so much work into the season. And, you know, Matt and I have celebrated your theme. We absolutely love it. And it's really been fascinating to hear an insight into it, Jay, because it is something that I think not a lot of people maybe put a lot of thought into. It's just they just hear a theme and think, okay, cool, that's a theme, let's get into the show. But it's always fascinating to kind of hear how a theme like that can come together and hearing all the processes involved in it. So I'm speaking to myself. I'm sure Matt will say something in a minute, but I'm just saying I've enjoyed every second of this chat to learn everything about this today. Oh,
it's been a pleasure to me, and it's quite amazing that people are still interested to talk about it after all these years.
No, definitely, and everyone knows I'm a huge fan of your theme, and I hope today has just brought back memories from all those years ago, and you know, maybe stuff that you had forgotten about, but you can look back now and actually enjoy the time of you guys all getting together and creating what I think is, a marvelous theme song for Survivor.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for having me on.